Hello and welcome to another episode of our Reflect series looking at the book of Revelation. In the last episode, we began looking at the 7 seals on the scroll that we learned about in chapter 5 of Revelation. And we looked at the first 3 seals being open and the judgment that came with each of them. And it was a very harsh image for us, but for those being persecuted, the judgment is a sign of God's justice. An answer to the question of why do the good suffer and the bad prosper? And the answer is that ultimately God's justice reigns. So we're going to take some time and read the next few verses of chapter 6 and explore just the next seal that's open. And then the next episode will finish off the seals of the first 6, and then the 7th will come a bit later on. So we're reading in verse 7 and verse 8 of chapter 6. When the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. So with the 4th seal being opened, again we see a horseman, and this time it's Death, followed by Hades, we are told. And Death is sitting on a sickly green horse. And that sickly green horse reflects the death and disease this horseman brings. Death and Hades were seen as realms where dead humans were held captive, but can also be made to be people who were seeking to enslave others and bring them into their domain of death. Now that we know the characters, John shows us what God is going to allow them to do, which is bring suffering and death over 1/4 of the earth. Now, we're not quite sure what that fully means. Does that mean they kill 1/4 of the earth, or they reign over 1/4 of the earth and kill within that? Either way, it's really bad. We need to recognize in verse 8, it reads, they were given power over. Or as other translations read, they were given authority over. Well, who gives them that authority? And there's no question in the book of Revelation that it is only God who is sovereign over all. And so it is God who gives them the authority to carry out this judgment on the world. And that can be hard for us, especially living in a comfortable North American culture where we're not persecuted, we're not suffering, we're not dealing with incredible injustices against us. But for those who are, that sense that God will bring just judgment and justice on those who persecute and harm them, can bring some comfort. Now, last episode we mentioned that each of the seals have been building on each other. This one is the culmination of the first 3. Death and Hades kills 4 ways: sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts. And we should see this as the summation of the first 3, the resulting effects of the chaos and societal breakdown that would have come from the first 3 seals, which brought invasion and civil unrest and famine. All as a part of God's judgment on the sinful nature of the world. We often see the Old Testament God and the New Testament God as different, and yet the God in Revelation in chapter 6 is a reminder of the God of the Old Testament and his judgment for sins. And that can, again, be a struggle for us, but the God of Scripture is one God and is consistent. Now, the severity of these 4 judgments of the first 4 seals need to be seen as unique. They are not everyday struggles of war and famine. They are the climax of God's judgment in the end times. This is a very unique time, a very unique occurrence. Jesus even talked about these woes when he talked about end times. So with 2 seals left, things are not going to get better, as the 6th seal seems to be even worse than the first 4. Also, you'll have noticed that there were 4 horsemen associated with the first 4 seals. These are commonly referred to in our culture as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, and they bring disaster with them. And of course, these are characters that have shown up in all sorts of movies and literature. They've captured imagination, they've brought fear and dread. But essentially all they do is they bring disaster with them. And of course the question is, how does God allow this? Why does God allow this? And how can God authorize this? But again, this is a passage of God's justice. We also need to keep in mind the whole of Scripture where we find God's love, grace, and deliverance. That is so prevalent. And we see God's patience in Scripture, but the end times, the time that these verses describe an end to those who rebel against God. It describes justice for those who do evil in the world and are godless and wicked. This is a setting right. And we need to remember that God is God and we are not. We cannot fully understand God or why he does things, but we do know his character has been shown us, and we know he's loving, he is faithful, and he is just. But justice has two sides to it. And we see here one side that God is authorizing be carried out to set things right. So as you wrestle with this, keep in mind the bigger picture of God's character, of God's work through Scripture and throughout history, and put in that context. And also keep in mind that we don't understand everything that's going on in our perspective, but God does. And God has deemed this as what is needed. And so there's a piece of us that has to take a step of faith to understand that if God is who we know him to be, which is loving, faithful, just, kind, compassionate, well, this comes in that context as well. So next week we're going to look at the final two seals in chapter 6. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.